Alright guys, next lesson I want to talk about today is solving quadratics. So we have three methods that we can use. One of them is to solve by factoring. We can also solve by taking the square root. And we'll learn how to factor by the quadratic formula. And for now, we're just going to stick with some basic looks at this middle one here, solving by taking the square root. We'll learn eventually another method called completing the square, where it gets a little bit more complicated. But for now, we're just going to do some basic stuff. So for example, number one here, let's look at x squared plus 4x minus 5 equals 0. Or really, let's say equals y. We'll do y equals. So when you're solving a quadratic equation, what you're really looking for is what are the x-intercepts, which we've kind of already talked about. So when you're finding an x-intercept, remember that's when y is equal to 0. So we first plug in 0 for y. And then in this case, we have three terms here. And notice that one of them is a linear term. It just has an x. In that case, we can eliminate this option. We can't solve this by square rooting it. So instead, we'll first start off by trying to factor it. And if this factors, then we can solve it by factoring. If it doesn't, we have to go back and try the quadratic formula. So here, in this case, x and x give us x squared. 5 and 1 would give you 5. And positive 5 minus 1 would give you 4. And it also, when you multiply, gives you the negative 5 on the end. So there's this thing in mathematics called the zero product rule. It says that whenever you have a product, two things that are multiplying each other, and it's equal to 0, you can split that product apart and set each factor equal to 0. So I think I mentioned that before in another video, but here it is again. So then you'd solve each equation and find that your solutions are at x equals negative 5 and x equals positive 1. Okay, so what that would mean is that if we were to go and graph this equation, 2, 3, 4, 5, it would have x-intercepts at 1 and at negative 5. And then looking back at the start of it here, we had a positive x squared term, which means that your graph's going to open upward. So the graph's going to do something like this. I don't know where the vertex is because I didn't find that. I don't know where the y-intercept is because I didn't find that either. But I do know that my y-intercept has to be a negative number, which is good to know. And I know that my vertex has to be somewhere in the third quadrant, which is also good information to know. So solving can help you figure out some cool stuff. Let's do another example over here. Y equals 2x squared minus 8. So again here, when you're solving, you're going to let y equal 0. And in this case, we don't have a linear term. There's no x, just x by itself in here. So this is one where you can solve it using square roots, the second method. So what you want to do there is try to get the square term, the quadratic part, get that by itself. So we would add 8 to both sides of our equation, and we would get 8 equals 2x squared. And then we can divide both sides by 2, and we'd get 4 equals x squared. And then notice that when you go to get rid of the square, once you get it by itself, you take the square root of both sides. Well, the square root of 4 is 2. This is something that's really, some mathematicians will simplify this too much. But here, something special happens when you take the square root of a variable squared. The answer is not just x, it's the absolute value of x. And then once you split that apart, that's where the plus or minus comes in. So some mathematicians or some teachers might just say that, oh, well, when you do this, you're going to get two solutions, plus or minus, and they never really explain why. It's because the square root of x squared isn't just x, it's the absolute value of x. and the absolute value of a number has two solutions. It has the positive one and the negative one. Remember that absolute value measures the distance that a number is from 0 on a number line. So there are two such numbers where the distance from that number to 0 is 2 units. And that's why you get the two solutions. Cool stuff. So what we know here in this situation is that your solutions are at 2 and -2. And again, since the graph was, or since the x squared term here was positive, we know that it has to open upward. And even more than that, we also know that the vertex has to be somewhere on the y-axis, which is also cool information to know, because it has to be directly in between the two x-intercepts. Okay, so that's cool stuff to know too. Let's do one down here that doesn't factor and doesn't have the square root, so we can see what the quadratic formula is. So like, for example, y equals 3x squared minus x plus 7. This thing isn't going to factor, so if we want to find where the solutions are, we have to use the quadratic formula, which is minus b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, so this is a formula that you probably have memorized in Algebra 1. By the way, most of these videos that I'm making are for an Algebra 2 class, so I kind of expect you to have some prior knowledge. So in this case, a would be 3, b would be -1, and c would be positive 7. So plugging stuff in, we'd get 1 plus or minus. We'd have -1 squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. And then we can start trying to work this out and reduce it down. So x would be 1 plus or minus, well, 4 times 3 is 12, times 7 is 84. So we're going to have 1 minus 84 there, all over 6. That would be 1 plus or minus the square root of -83 all over 6, which for now, that would be where you would stop. Eventually, we'll start talking about complex numbers. Something that's complex when you have the square root of a negative in it. And we're going to let that be called I, but we haven't talked about that yet, so don't worry about this for now. Just know that this would be your answer, and since you can't take the square root of a negative number yet, this means that this equation up here has no x-intercepts, which means that it's not going to cross the x-axis at all. So since it has to open upward, what that'll tell you is that your vertex has to be above the x-axis. Since it has to open up, it has to do something like this, and it can't cross the x-axis, so it couldn't be down here, because then you'd cross. It has to be above the x-axis. So that's cool information to know too. Okay? So those are your three methods: solving by factoring, solving by taking the square root, or solving using the quadratic formula. They all three will work depending on what type of equation you have. They're all three really useful for finding x-intercepts. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to leave a comment below. Otherwise, good luck with your math.